The torpedo lay on the rusted trailer like a sleeping leviathan someone had mistaken for junk, its flank mottled with salt scab and flaking paint, the stenciled numbers eroded by decades of weather into a ghost of arithmetic. Tamsin Mercer stood with her hands in the pockets of a windbreaker gone shiny at the seams, watching the auctioneer's gloved hand circled toward Lot 47 like the second hand of a clock that had finally decided to move. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She told herself she'd come for the battery housings and the guidance frame. For salvage she could mill and sell and keep her struggling shop afloat one more month. But she could feel her pulse in her throat each time the wind knifed through the rows of surplus gear and tugged at the blue tarp that only half covered the torpedo's nose. Two gulls coasted low over the yard of the old naval depot, sounding like squeaky pulleys. Diesel exhaust hung sweet and oily in the morning, and the sea beyond the chain-link fence kept breathing its cold breath over the concrete, patient as a metronome. The crowd had that familiar salvage auction composition, men in Carhartt and salt-blanched caps, a few speculators in polished boots and sunglasses, one or two museum people with clipboards pretending not to care. Tamsin knew their types the way a diver knows currents. She knew who would chase steel by the pound and who would sniff for history by the ounce. She had seen the torpedo yesterday while the lots were open for inspection. The foreman, a guy with harpoon tattoos and a good heart, had winked at her and slipped off the tarp. Under the grime, the paint had been something like faded sky, not the combat gray she expected, a training blue. Exercise torpedo. Those, she knew, should be empty of war's teeth, filled instead with water ballast and mock-up guts. They were meant to be fired and recovered, their noses capped with dye packs that bloomed orange for the chase boats. No charges, no detonators, nothing to make a small shop owner's life end in a headline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. It should have been common. The depot had been bleeding excess for a year now. Expired rations, cracked fiberglass radomes, coils of deck cable like molting pythons. But the weld seam around the torpedo's nose had stopped her. It was wrong. Someone had scarfed and re-welded it. Different bead, different hand. The inspection tag riveted near the suspension lugs was not Navy. It was a later civilian replacement, the kind you see when a museum has a volunteer program and a welder who wants to help but doesn't own the right wire. Except that this bead was too perfect for a volunteer. It had the uniform thread of shop work, not dockside kindness. She'd lain awake the night before and seen that seam every time she closed her eyes. Lot 47 came up with the auctioneer's sing-song spattering, the air fast as rain. Surplus exercise torpedo, unknown make, sold as is, where is, non-functioning, demilled, no energetic components, buyer assumes all responsibility. Do I hear 500, 500, 5? A gloved hand went up. Another. 700 in 5 seconds. Then 950. Tamsin climbed to her number because she had already accepted that she would be reckless today, in ways she would be practical again tomorrow. 1100. 12. She watched for the men in sunglasses, the ones who never seemed to wipe sweat and whose boots stayed clean even in salt yards. One of them, a trim man in a charcoal jacket too thin for the wind, didn't bid at all, just watched the others bid. He wasn't there for the number. He was there for the result. 1400, someone called. 16, Tamsin heard herself say, lifting her paddle. The auctioneer's gaze ticked over her like a scanner, registering small shop coat, black crescents of grease under the nails, a woman alone in an ocean of men. He didn't condescend. He had seen her here before. 1700 in the back. Do I hear 18? She looked at the torpedo. The seam winked in the light like a secret. She felt the old hunger she tried not to honor, the one that had gotten her into diving wrecks in her 20s when she was fearless because she thought fear belonged to ordinary people. Her father's voice blew through her mind the way the sea wind blew through everything down here. When you don't know what it is, don't, poke it. If you must, poke it with a yard of oak." 19, she said. The man in the charcoal jacket still hadn't bid, but a bidder 3 rows ahead, someone she half knew by face, a guy who'd stripped more tugboats than she'd read novels, glanced sideways in a way that admitted he was bidding for somebody else. 2,000, he barked. Tamsin felt her stomach drop. 2,000 was beyond scrap math now. 2,000 meant someone had already made the case that whatever was inside the demilled casing mattered more than steel by the pound. She could walk. She could let the man in the clean boots enjoy his outcome. She could also lose sleep for a year and kick herself during every bad month for not stepping closer to the seam and asking it its name. 21, she said. 22, from the tugboat man. 25, Tamsin heard, and realized it was her own voice again, steady as if she were reciting inventory. That finally made the man in charcoal speak, not to the auctioneer, but to the tugboat man. His head didn't move, only his lips did. One word. A no. Silence pooled. The auctioneer's cadence softened, as if he could smell the end of weather. 2,500 going once, going twice. Sold to bidder 117. Applause from no one and everyone. That strange salt-yard applause made of boots shifting and shoulders untensing. Paperwork, a receipt stamped so hard the ink bled through. A yellow tag zip-tied to a lifting lug like a hospital band. And then the forklift wheezing forward with a clatter that made gulls explode into the air, the operator grinning at her as if she had bought a piece of the moon. "What me to set it right on your trailer, Miss Mercer?" the foreman asked. He always called her Miss Mercer like she was his niece. "Or you're gonna want the gantry?" "Trailer's fine. I brought straps." He nodded, then leaned in close while the forklift approached and the torpedo swung a little on the chain as if some sleepy animal had stirred. "You got eyes at your back. You should," he murmured. "That fella in the suit has a look I don't like. Not bid and lose. Remember and return." "I saw him," Tamsin said, checking the nylon slings for fray the way you check a stranger lies for lies. "I've got friends who can be here in 10 if I yell." "Yell sooner," he said, and walked away pretending he hadn't said anything at all. She strapped the torpedo down crosswise, then fore and aft, then put a block under the tail so it wouldn't scissor the straps if she braked hard. She slid the nose under her tarpaulin and made a mess of knots that any Boy Scout would roll his eyes at. None of it would stop a determined thief, but liminal measures, her father had called them with a smile. Not walls, and not nothing, either. The kinds of protections you put up when you lived your life between. She pulled away from the yard with the torpedo a dark presence under the tarp in her rearview mirror. The depot fence trailed off into marsh where cattails shivered and the sky's reflection broke into nervous geometry. The road to her shop followed the harbor's blackwater, a narrow 2-lane with potholes memorized by local spines. She checked her mirror more than she needed, and because she checked, she saw it. The charcoal jacket's vehicle, a newer white van that felt like a blank page, one of those panel vans companies wrap with prints of fruit or smiling plumbers. This one was undecorated, so white she could taste the bleach on it. He stayed 3 cars behind all the way into town. He stayed through one sudden yellow that disappointed everyone, and he stayed when she turned into the cracked lot behind her shop, idled at the curb for an honest 2 seconds, then eased on as if that had been his destination all along.
She backed the trailer into the bay with the slow pride of a person who could back a trailer into a thimble, and then pulled the steel doors shut. The whole building exhaled with her. It was no fortress, but it had good bones. A former net-mending warehouse that still smelled faintly of rope and squid when the heat came on. Her workbench took up half the floor. a sternum of bolted timbers and vice jaws polished by years of hands. The chain hoist on the I-beam overhead was older than she was and worked better than any she'd ever bought new. A coffee maker crouched on top of a tool cabinet like a small stove that mostly kept her sane. "Okay," she said aloud to the room and the torpedo and the ghosts of the men who had built it. "Let's see what you are." She didn't go at it with force. That was amateurs and movies. She swept first, because grit in the wrong place in a shop multiplies like rabbits. Then she set out what she would need and what she hoped she wouldn't. Calipers, inspection mirror, bright LED probe, penetrant oil, a length of oak dowel, 2 wedges of Dilron, her father's battered dog-eared copy of explosive ordnance disposal for the civilian salvager, a book he had compiled over a lifetime and stapled and given to her on the day he realized she would work with dangers no matter what he said. She photographed it like a crime scene. Ruler in frame, Sharpie arrows, weld seam 3 degrees off standard plane, nose cap with tool marks that weren't stock, suspension lugs with 1 replaced bolt, wrong thread pitch, different patina. Guidance section scuffed in ways that suggested it had stood on end, not laid flat for years. Training torpedo, she thought. Likely an Mk-44 or 46 adapted for repeated captures. Electric drive originally, now no drive at all. Inert by all promises. But promises made by paper and men who wanted to empty a yard didn't keep you alive. She texted Bavik. "Got a patient for you. Exercise torpedo. Welded nose seam doesn't match documentation. Wrong fastener at lug. Need eyes that aren't mine." His reply came in a hurry of dots that said he was in the lab pretending not to be on his phone. "Send pics. Also, for the love of little gods, no cutting until we rule out everything." "No cutting," she replied. "I'll woo it until it confesses." She wooed it with the LED probe first, snaking the light into every port she could access without committing a sin. Water ballast ports gave her glimpses of rust that looked like old bread. The empty drive bay echoed her breath back at her. She measured the nose cap circumference and heard herself mutter numbers, a habit of hers that made people think she was talking to someone who wasn't there. She was talking to machines that had gotten her through divorces and griefs and winters. The nose cap was the thing. It had the wrong seam and the right anxiety. She could see where someone had ground it smooth and repainted to hide the work, but the grind marks had different arcs than Navy work. More patient, more careful. A good hand. Whoever had done it knew that salt and time would erase the signature of their bead if they let the ocean chew at it long enough. They hadn't counted on a woman who had the habit of falling in love with wrongness. She looked up when she felt, rather than heard, the sound outside. A vehicle easing back down the alley, tire by tire, slow as sleepwalking. A shadow slid along the gap where her doors didn't quite meet, a smudge on daylight. She moved closer to the doors and stood with her toe against the steel's bottom edge, listening. Long seconds. Nothing your hands could hold. Then the shadow was gone. She dialed. "Hey," said a voice that always came with sawdust in it. "May, friend, sometimes backer, girl who welded in poetry. You alive?" "White van, from the yard. He did a drive-by." "Want me to swing by and be big?"
"Yes," Tamsin said, surprising herself with how quickly. "Bring that ridiculous pry bar you named after your ex." "On my way," May said, and hung up before tenderness could make either of them ruin their ordinary. Tamsin breathed. She set her shoulders to the work again. The chain hoist lifted the torpedo from the trailer, inch by creaking inch, until it hung in the bay like a whale in an iron ocean. She cribbed and blocked and belted it into a cradle she trusted. She rolled her tool cart up to its nose the way a medic wheels up to a patient. She taped a strip of paper around the seam to give herself a datum, marked 12 o'clock with a line, and began testing the seam with the tip of an oak dowel and a rubber mallet, tapping like she was listening for a cracked bell to confess. At 8 o'clock on her paper, the note changed. Not metal on solid, but metal on hollow, and not navy hollow, not the song of a die pack or an aluminum ballast plug. This sounded like void beyond something dense. She took her time with penetrant oil at the seam, walking the oil in with a toothbrush the way her father had taught her to do with stuck fasteners on boats that had seen too many winters. The first fastener she tried on the nose cap didn't want to confess its size. She tried 5 sockets and swore once and promised to apologize to no one later. The 6th fit with the soft satisfaction of something completing its intention. She watched the threads climb as she turned. Half turn, breath. Half turn, breath. The bolt came out smelling like home. Metal. Salt. The old story of water. She set it in a tray she had labeled with a Sharpie, left to right, 12 to 11 o'clock. May arrived like storms arrive on radar, visible before audible. The door rolled up, and with it came cold air and the sense that the world was not a field of one. May's shoulders filled the door, and then she was inside, hair in a knot, eyes the color of new steel. "You are not kidding," she said, looking up at the torpedo. "If this is a phase, it's on brand." "Help me swear at this seam," Tamsin said. "Will do," May said, and set the pry bar down where light could admire it. They worked the bolts out in a circle and set each in its assigned nesting place until the nose cap stopped pretending and began to understand it would have to leave. It wasn't light. Nothing on the water that mattered was ever light. They rigged straps and lowered the cap onto a foam pad with the care of people who break things for a living, but know how to be gentle at the exact second gentleness matters. Behind the cap was not navy. Behind the cap was mirror-clean titanium, whose grain announced precision like cathedral stone announces worship. May let out a breath that sounded like a curse and a prayer in the same syllable. That doesn't belong. No, it doesn't. The titanium wasn't navy structural. It was a tube, its cylindrical face etched with cereals she didn't recognize, and around its flange someone had used an adhesive sealant that had the smell of aerospace more than salt yards. She put her inspection mirror into the gap and angled the LED until the reflection showed her what her gut had already guessed. Tamper marks so faint they had to be real. "I'm calling Bavik. If this is what I think it is, he'll want to tell me I'm wrong, followed by, 'I told you so,' followed by, 'Can I come over?'" "Call your ex-Navy explosive friend too," May said, "not because I think this is going to boom, but because if I don't hear you say the phrase, 'render safe' today, I will get cranky." Tamsin dialed Cam last, because seeing his name on her phone still did a small thing to her heart. She wished it didn't. He had been good to her father at the end, the way some men are good to men who taught them to respect both sea and stubbornness. "Mercer," he said, answering on the second ring, "tell me you finally decided to stop sticking your hands into history's shark mouth." "Come over," she said. "Bring your idiot kit." "You find a tooth?" "A jaw." He arrived between breaths, or maybe 20 minutes later, which in the chemistry of anxiety is the same dose. He walked under the torpedo like a priest under a cathedral arch and whistled softly at the titanium. The whistle told her 2 things. He was impressed, and he wanted to cover that with humor. Training torpedo with a boutique can. Somebody loved this enough to be precise. Smugglers? Spies? People. People with something that hated daylight. He went through a ritual Tamsin recognized and appreciated. Checks for any remote power that had somehow missed a cutoff saw, Geiger counter because the universe is rude. Vapor meter because the universe is ruder. Each instrument reported boredom. Cam looked at her over the top of one as if to say, "We've done due diligence. Now we have to do the thing we came to do." Suggest we rig the tube out as a unit. Don't open in place. Things you want to keep on your terms. They cleared a table. They cleared a larger table. May rearranged half the shop like she was playing chess with gravity. Tamsin's hands were steady in a way that felt borrowed. They freed the tube from its seat with patient torque, the adhesive surrendering with small groans like old wood in winter. When it finally came free, it came free with grace, as if it had wanted to move toward hands that would treat it like a heart. Tamsin could feel the weight of it, and the weight was strange, not lead and not empty. Something dense, yes, but balanced, in a way that made her think of carefully packed cases that had always made TSA use their special swabs. Cam set the tube down on rubber feet. He ran fingers over the end cap like a doctor palpating a wound. "You open, I open, or we fight for it?"
My shop, Tamsin said. My seam. Your lawsuit if it sprays multi-million-dollar screw-you juice on all of us, May muttered, but she was smiling because fear and joy live next door. Tamsin took the spanner Cam handed her and fit it to the notches on the cap. She had never loved a right turn so much in her life. The cap moved, then resisted, then thought about who it was dealing with and demurred. A thin exhalation of air slipped past her ear and into the room with a papery sound, old vacuum arguing with present weather. She tasted dust and tin and something sweet like machine oil. There was a second cap inside the first, smaller, with a tapper wire threaded through 2 holes and sealed with an aluminum crimp. The crimp had once had a serial, but it had been buffed lightly enough to insult, but not erase. Somebody didn't want this opened without witnesses, Cam said softly. Somebody didn't want it opened again, Tamsin corrected, feeling the knowledge settle while the hair on her arms considered options. She snipped the wire with a flush cutter, the way you snip thread you've trusted for too long. The inner cap took less persuasion, as if it were more interested in truth than performance. When it came off, it left the smell of cedar and glue, sharp as memory. There was a velvet cylinder inside the titanium, dark as a bruise and tied with cotton twine that had gone the color of tea. On the velvet, someone had written a date in a hand that belonged to a steady person, 1966. Another line, neat as darning, for retrieval only by H. Please tell me H stands for honesty and this is a thesis about ethics, or a confession, or a love letter that cost somebody too much, Cam said. Tamsin slid the velvet out and felt the human in it, the care, the choice of twine over ribbon because twine lives longer. Her wrists shook like a small quake, like a glass truck passing in the street. She thought of her father teaching her to open things slowly so that the inside had time to understand the outside wasn't there to hurt it. Her phone buzzed against the bench. Bavik, do not move anything until I see it. Too late, she typed, and then softer, hurry. She untied the twine. The velvet unfurled and revealed its impossibility. Pouches, small and square, each with a paper label glued to one face. C1, C2, C3. The labels were typewritten in that mechanical font that makes you hear the bell and carriage return even when you're born in a century that never had them. She opened C1 because numbers, like stories, ought to start at the beginning. Inside was light. Not light, stone acting like light. A crystal that was sleeping and had just remembered its job. She didn't exhale for 3 heartbeats because the thing in her palm threw blue the way a bay throws blue at noon. Not paint, but inward radiance. It was cold, and it had that slippery heft that only a precious stone has. Old, unheated by the silk of it.
Cashmere, her mind said in a voice she didn't know she knew. Cornflower, velvet. There are sapphires, and there are sapphires the way there are songs, and there are the 3 notes your mother hummed when she wanted you to sleep. Tamsin had handled stones a little in her time helping an estate clear out a jeweler's shop, but this one was not inventory. This one was blue the way prayer is blue. She looked up and saw the same knowledge reflecting back at her out of May's face and Cam's. Cam wasn't a gem guy, but he was a value guy. May knew art. She didn't have to say anything because her mouth had found no words that made sense next to the color. C2 held another, less big and more proud. C3 another. They were not trash. They were not chips. They were stones people write about and then pretend they made the blue up because no one believes a sky can fit in a fist. Who hides cashmere stones in a torpedo? May whispered, awed and angry. Someone who knows that thieves look for jewelry boxes and not for ordnance. Someone who knows that the one place no one wants to take home is the one place where a secret can sleep. Bhavik burst through the door then, with his backpack like a grad student who had decided to live forever by running toward rather than away. He took in the scene, made a noise, and then went absolutely still like the good minds do when the world exceeds their notes. "How many?" he asked, softly, like the room had a baby in it. "3 so far," Tamsin said. "I can count higher." They opened only 4 more because even joy needs governance. C4 was smaller, like a punctuation between declarations. C5 was a green so clear it felt like spring water, a stone the size of a thumbnail that could buy a building. Emerald, but not Colombian. Afghani maybe. C6 and C7 were softer blues again, each with handwriting on paper tucked beneath the cotton. Weights, to the 100th of a carat and a date.
"It's a ledger in pouches," Bhavik said, his voice trying and failing not to vibrate. "Someone cataloged an entire cache and put it in a torpedo," May said. "Worth?" Cam asked, the practical question he couldn't help. Bhavik shook his head like a dog clearing water. "If these are what they look like, and if there are, how many pouches?" Tamsin counted the labels without opening them. C1 through C24 in one column, C25 through C48 in another. There were more, tucked behind a thin plank of cedar like a false back that wasn't trying very hard to be false. 48 at least, she said, and probably another row behind this, and... She stopped, because sound had come back from outside. Not the van idling, not one vehicle, 2. The echo in the alley said big tires, the kind that don't mind curbs. May had the pry bar in her hands without remembering picking it up. Cam palmed the inner cap the way you palm a coin when you're willing to bet it and lose it in the same breath. Bhavik tucked his hands into his backpack, not because there was anything in there that would help, but because hands need places. Tamsin wrapped the velvet cylinder back around the pouches with an instinct that felt older than money. Her mouth was very dry. She had one thought, bright and ridiculous. If her father could see her, he would be both furious and proud in a single expression he had invented for the purpose of raising her. The knock on the steel roll-up door was not the kind of knock you give before you say a friend's name. It was the kind of knock that says the knuckles doing the knocking have never met a door they didn't consider temporary. "Mercer," a voice called, placid and public. The kind of calm that comes out of men who carry quiet the way other men carry pistols. "Open up. We'd like to talk about a certain lot you purchased this morning." Cam's eyes met Tamsin's, and in them she read a silent arithmetic they had both memorized. Routes, covers, weights, people that mattered. The smallness of her shop felt like a choice she had made on purpose and was now regretting. The torpedo hung overhead with its nose open like a story that had started speaking and couldn't be stopped without cruelty. The knock came again, not angrier, more certain. Somewhere, a truck door sighed shut, and the slow cadence of boots on gravel moved closer, a count Tamsin could have metronomed with her breath.
She slid the velvet cylinder back into the titanium tube with hands that still tried to be gentle. She couldn't stop herself. The stones had not asked to be chased and weighed and named. They had asked to be handled like pieces of sky. Mercer, the voice said, and this time it was not public. It knew her name the way the white van knew her alley. This isn't a search. This is a retrieval. Tamsin reached for the spanner. May lifted the pry bar and smiled in a way that made the pry bar look small. Cam palmed the inner cap the way you palm a coin when you're willing to bet it and lose it in the same breath. Bavik tucked his hands into his backpack, not because there was anything in there that would help, but because hands need places. The steel door latch rattled, and the old lock gave its first exhausted complaint. The last thing Tamsin saw before the deadbolt she'd once called good enough, screamed and leapt, was a scatter of blue on her palm. One last glint from a single thread of cotton that had kissed a stone and kept the color like a secret. And then the deadbolt snapped.
Steel jumped in its keeper, and the roll-up shuddered on its tracks like a beast uncoiling. The noise was uglier than it needed to be. Not volume, but intention. Tamsin felt it in her teeth. Her body moved the way bodies do when they've been practicing for a moment they had no right to expect. She slid between the table and the hoist stand, palm on the chain like a prayer, breath low, eyes on the door. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The latch rattled once more, and then the door came up in a chop. A slice of gray daylight cutting the dark of the shop, boots first. Then the man in charcoal, jacket wet at the hem from alley splash. Two others bracketing him with faces that looked like shoes, scuffed, impersonal, meant to be used. "Ms. Mercer," Charcoal said, with the kind of politeness that comes with purchase orders. He showed her a badge in a wallet that was more leather than legality. "Contractor for a federal custodian. We're here to retrieve government property inadvertently released at public auction." "Cool story," May said. From Tamsin's right, pry bar resting across her forearms like a tame thunderbolt. "Got a warrant to go with the novella?" The two men's eyes skated to May, and then back to Tamsin. Charcoal kept his attention where it paid. "The item is unsafe in untrained hands," he said. "Let's not turn this into paperwork that makes everyone tired." Behind them, the alley held its breath. No sirens, no saviors. Just the whisper of tires turning slow, a white van idling with the patience of money. Tamsin let herself be afraid for exactly 1 second. In that second, she calculated what she could afford to lose and what she couldn't. Titanium tube. Friends, the sense that she could still live in this town as herself after today. The math came back with only one solution: stall until light found them. "Unsafe?" she said, and let her eyebrows ask the question for her mouth. "It's a demilled exercise body. Your people sold it to me with a tag that says so." "Tags are for auctions. Truth is for custodians." "Then tell me the truth," she said, surprising herself with the heat in it. "What's in my shop?" He looked at the open nose, at the titanium on the table, at Cam and Bavik doing their best to look like ornaments and not fire alarms. "Something that belongs somewhere else," he said. "Miss Mercer, we can do kindness or we can do compliance. Kindness tends to knock. Compliance learns how to spell warrant." "Mercer," Cam murmured. She could hear the "don't throw gasoline" inside the syllables. Charcoal took 3 slow steps into the shop, like he was smelling for things he could claim. He had the posture of a man who had never had to lift anything heavier than a signature. "Here is my problem," he said. Conversational. "I don't know what you've moved. I don't know what you've opened. I can see that you've compromised original seals." He gestured toward the delicate aluminum crimp Tamsin had cut. That is going to be a memo. I'd like to keep it the kind that gets filed and forgotten, not the kind that turns people's lives into meetings. Funny, May said. My problem is 3 men in my friend's shop who think badges printed at Kinko's are a good look. May, Tamsin said softly. She kept her eyes on charcoal and moved her hand to the chain 1 link higher. 2 inches of lift would swing the torpedo's tail closer to the door. 4 inches would make it an obstacle. 8 might make it a wall. She had blocked the cradle like a zealot. The hoist could take the torque. The question was whether her courage could. It wasn't courage that saved them. It was habit. May's thumb, without consulting anyone, had found the little gray mushroom beside the bay door, an ancient emergency stop for the roll-up lift that had been disconnected for years. The mushroom did nothing. What did something was the bright red paddle switch next to it, the one that cut the row of shop lights along the ceiling and sent the fluorescence into a long, humming death. Darkness thudded down, not total, but enough that the alley light turned the men into paper silhouettes and the shop into a place of echoes. Bavik made a sound like an apology and knocked the tool against concrete on purpose. Cam slid the inner titanium cap into his bag like he was putting a coin in the fountain and hoping for a merciful God. Hey, one of the shoe faces said, hand rising toward his jacket. No, Charcoal said quickly. And because his voice had the muscle of habit, the hand stopped. Power's out all the time, Tamsin said. 4th nor'easter in 2 weeks. Lines get tired. Her voice shook. She let it. Let them hear it and think what they wanted. People who thought you were rattled gave you an extra 2 seconds. She needed 6.
She pulled the chain. The hoist answered like a friend who had never learned how to say no. The torpedo rose with a yawning groan. Swing 6. The men looked up. Swing 8. May took 1 step forward and became taller somehow, without changing height. Back, Charcoal said to his men, a word he disliked saying. He took a slow breath, like a diver negotiating with his own lungs. Miss Mercer, I do not want anyone hurt. I do not want to hurt you. I do want to leave with that tube. Great, Tamsin said. I want to leave with that tube too. Wild how interests align. Whose initials are H? May asked into the dark. Yours? Charcoal's face flinched at H like a reflex, then ironed itself into professional nothing. That's classified, he said, and Tamsin knew in that second that H was a person, and that person mattered. Call, Bavik whispered near her elbow. Call now. She didn't have to. A home barked outside. Short, twice, the depot foreman's signature from 100 mornings. Then another sound behind it, higher and urgent, a police siren doing its best impression of a gull. Not big city cavalry, harbor cops, a blue truck with a light bar that worked when it wanted to, a cap with coffee-stained rings in the cup holders, a pair of officers who did more boat wakes than bar fights, but still knew the difference between law and a man who had decided he was enough. Charcoal did the math. It wrote itself across his posture. He stepped backward with the grace of a man who had learned in some other life how to retreat without saying the word. This isn't over, he said, but his tone had changed. Less decree, more documentation. Nor'easter knocks the lights out all the time. You know how it is. They backed into the alley with a professionalism that made Tamsin angry only because it made her admire it. The door rattled down. The lock hung in a finger of metal like a broken tooth. The hoist creaked in the quiet that came after men had left, but tension hadn't. Tamsin let the chain slip, let the torpedo settle an inch, 2, until the metal sigh sounded like relief. She exhaled and only then realized she'd never really inhaled. Police, a voice called through the door. This knock knew her name because it had called raffle numbers with her at the fish fry and asked for her father by his first name when he was still around to answer.
Tam, you decent? We got a call about folks who don't know how to ask permission. She rolled the door up for Officer Del Toro and his partner Hawes, who had the calm of a tree that's seen every winter. Their eyes took in the hoist, and the open nose, and the titanium, and the way the air itself felt like it had been lifted and set down slightly wrong. "Busy morning," Hawes said. "Long story," Tamsin said. Del Toro tilted his head at the door. "We saw a white van pretend it was going to the bait shop. I pretended to believe it. I do not think it believed me. You want to tell me what they wanted?" "Property they said was government. They didn't have paper with stamps." The officer's eyes did a tiny dance that said they knew two kinds of men too well, the kind who said please and meant it, and the kind who said please and meant something else entirely. "You want a file?" Hawes asked. "Yes," May said before Tamsin could do the reflex that says, "You don't want to trouble the town with your trouble. We want a record that men came in here and threatened to take without legal authority." Del Toro wrote, while Hawes photographed the broken lock and the footprints no one bothers to have when they're trying to be ghosts. They promised to swing by the depot and make calls. They promised to park down the block for a while like hunters who didn't mind waiting because they knew deer would be deer. When the door rolled back down and the police truck idled 2 storefronts away, like a friend waiting for school to let out, the shop shrunk back into one room and what was in it. "Okay," Cam said. "New rule. Nothing leaves this building without paper more complicated than my last divorce." "Seconded," May said. "Motion carried." Bavik was already kneeling by the titanium tube again, eyes bright and wet in a way he would later blame on dust. "Tam, we have to see the rest. We also have to not get arrested by the kind of people who do arrest without saying the word." "We document everything," Tamsin said. She could feel the words settle her spine. "Weights, photos, video. We don't sell, we don't promise. We figure out provenance before dollar signs make us stupid." "That's no fun," May said, but she was smiling, relief and adrenaline arguing in her grin. They worked like a team that had never been called a team and didn't need to be. Bavik set up his DSLR and a GoPro on a little tripod that always lived in his bag like a pet. Cam laid out lint-free cloth and nitrile gloves like they were dressing for a surgery. May handled the chain hoist and the door and the perspective. If someone walked by and looked in, she'd be the one they saw first. And most men with shoe faces see tall women with bars of steel before they see blue stones. Tamsin untied the velvet again and made her hands obey. C8 through C12 were sapphires, each a different way of saying blue. C13 was a yellow that made her think of afternoon windows in kitchens. C14 and C15 were greens with gardens inside. The notes beneath each pouch were methodical. Weight, color call, clarity letter, a 2-letter code that might have been origin or wishful thinking. "Whoever H is," Bavik said, "they weren't a hobbyist. They had a loop and time." "What do you think for value?" Cam asked, and it sounded less tacky than it should have because they all knew value here wasn't greed, it was context. It was what you tell an insurance company, a judge, a newspaper, a friend, to make them understand that this is not common, that it is a why. Bavik hesitated. "On what we've seen, wholesale, as stones, without stories." He named a number that made everyone in the room go quiet, as if the air had suddenly decided to get taller. "And with story?" May said. "With story," Bavik said. "You add the part where men break locks and grow badges. You add provenance. You add the reason someone hid them where the ocean sleeps. You add 1966. "Why 1966? Tamsin asked. She heard the year like a bell now that it had rung once. "Because it was written by a hand that belonged to a person who graduated before computers. Because the typewriter used a ribbon someone re-inked with patience. Because Kashmir saw men with guns and men with money that year, and some of those men never wrote their names on anything at all, but still changed where stones slept.
Because I like to hear myself guess. He looked sheepish. And because my uncle was a jeweler who kept a shoebox full of magazines about the blue. What if H is a harbor worker who got suckered into a theft ring and couldn't live with himself, May said. What if he took the stones and hid them until he could grow a conscience? What if H is a woman, Cam said. Somebody's secretary who had keys and courage. What if these were never supposed to be sold, and someone created a treasure that was really a secret with a timer? Tamsin touched the velvet with her fingertips and felt beneath it the hours that had dressed these pouches, the decision that had chosen twine. What if the point of a secret is not the keeping, but the choosing when to let it out, she said. They found a rolled tube of paper beneath the cedar false back. It wasn't a will, it wasn't a heist map. It was stranger and neater. A copy of a letter typed on onion skin, the carbon faint but legible. The signature, a first initial and a last name, cut off by a too narrow platen. H. Rowe, something that could be Rowe or Rowan. Dated March 1966, addressed to no one and everyone. If you are reading this, the torpedo has been decommissioned, or you have better bolt cutters than I do. I won't name the places or people for fear of what names can do, but I will say that the stones in this can came through hands that were not paid what they were owed, across lines that were not drawn with their consent. I took them from the men who took them, not for myself, but because some things need a longer story than one greedy day. There is a ledger in a safer place. This is the evidence that the ledger is not a lie. If you can get the can to H, he will know what to do. If you can't, then at least do one thing for me. Weigh them, name them, and publish the truth of them, not for the money, for the record. H. Oh, May breathed. Now I want to punch and hug this person. H, Cam repeated. H. Rowe. Rowe probably. Or Roland? Harlan. Hector. Henry? Harry. Hell. My grandmother's last name was Houghton, Bavik said, then laughed at himself. My brain would like to audition unrelated data for this role. Tamsin held the onion skin to the light. The shadows of the typed letters ghosted onto her knuckles like a promise that could still keep itself. She read the line about publish the truth and felt it become a compass in her chest. Then we publish, she said. How? May asked. You want to put this on the shop blog under Weird Thursdays? I want to call someone who knows where truth goes when it needs to be seen, and someone who knows how to keep facts from getting folded into fancy when men with lawsuits show up. Anita, Cam said. He didn't look happy to say the name, but he said it anyway. Anita Qureshi, maritime law. Owes your father because he kept her first boat from sinking. Still sends fish on holidays. Call, Tamsin said.
He did. The conversation had too many hmms and rights and I hear yous to be soothing, but when he hung up, he looked less like a man who wanted to leave a state and more like a man who could stand in one for a while. She's coming, he said, with a colleague who does cultural property and art crime, which I didn't know was a real job. Apparently it is when people steal entire frescoes. Time? May asked. An hour and change, Cam said, which is generous because she's 60 minutes away if lights cooperate. We hold, we lock, we document, we breathe. They did all three. They weighed, photographed, read aloud each pouch's label into Bavik's camera as if this were a baptism, as if each number meant a person somewhere less hungry than yesterday. H's pouches went to 36 before the cedar's second false back offered another velvet roll and another set of squares. 60, then 72. Through it all, the shop clock nagged at minutes, and the police truck down the block made ally sounds when other vehicles slowed where they shouldn't. Between C-73 and C-74, Tamsin's phone vibrated itself toward the edge of the bench. She caught it before it could jump. Unknown number. She let it beep twice more and then answered because courage sometimes looks like a polite voice. Ms. Mercer?
said Charcoal from somewhere close enough she could hear him breathe. "I hope your municipal friends are enjoying their tour of your neighborhood. I told them the white van sells bread. They told me the bread must be shy." "Bread is a notoriously private carbohydrate," she said. "What do you want?" "A conversation not in front of people with dash cams," he said. "Walk to your back door. Alone." She looked toward the door. May shook her head before Tamsin even finished the motion. Cam's lips flattened. Bavik mouthed no, as if he were spelling it in a script that could save. Tamsin put the phone on speaker and set it on the bench like an insect she didn't want near her ear. "You are on Candid Audio," she said. "Say hi to the room." Charcoal sighed, and for the first time she heard something like fatigue in him. "Ms. Mercer, if we had the luxury of paperwork, you would already have it. We don't. What we have is an obligation to clean up mistakes. A torpedo body left this morning containing material that is the subject of a federal investigation that began before you could drive." "What kind of material?" Bavik asked. "Blue kind? Green kind?" "These are stolen cultural items," Charcoal said, and there was a new note in his voice, one that almost tasted like respect for something, not a person. "I don't care about your curiosity or your bills. I care about getting them back where they go." "Where's that? Your van?" There was a pause. "No," he said. "A safer place than your table." "And if we give them to you, how will we know they go to that place and not to someone who thinks finder's fee is a verb?" Another pause, this one longer. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the belt of officialdom. It sounded like a person trying to get a cat out from under a porch without lying to it. "Because there is a ledger," he said softly. "Because H sent 2 packages in 1966, and we've been looking for the second one since a whistleblower found the first one in a file cabinet someone tried to burn in 1971. Because there are names in that book that do not live on our coasts, and they deserve their stones back more than any museum wants to polish them. Because," he broke off like he said more than he meant, "because this is the part of my job that lets me sleep." Tamsin didn't know she'd been holding her breath until her lungs asked whether she planned to include them again. She looked at the onion skin letter. Publish the truth. She looked at her friends. She looked at the camera that had been blinking the whole time. "Meet us with your papers, and bring the person in charge, not a man in a jacket that looks like a haircut." The line went quiet. "He's 3 hours away," Charcoal said. "By the time he gets there, the van without bread might have to stretch its legs." "Then you can wait with Del Toro. He tells jokes. They get better after an hour." He laughed then, not nicely and not unkindly. "You know," he said, "for a person who buys torpedoes at breakfast, you are surprisingly calm." "I learned to breathe underwater young," she said, and ended the call before he could make her like him more than she wanted to.
Anita arrived in 80 minutes with a woman in a blazer the color of unpolished bronze and a pelican case built like a secret. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Lele Saraf and shook hands like she respected wrists. She listened to the short version without letting short become sloppy, read H's letter without asking for a chair, and then opened her case with a sigh that sounded like a violin deciding to be brave. "This is a field spectrometer," she said, and then saw Bavik's face and smiled. "Yes, I know. It's a toy and a reassurance, not a verdict, but it will tell us we're not crazy." She directed a probe's light onto C1's face and nodded at the graph her tablet drew, a mountain range of certainty. "Corundum," she said, "as advertised by our eyeballs. No heat signs I can detect without a lab. Likely cashmere by the silk. If anyone asks, we say appears. We don't say is until the grown-ups with letters after their names bless us." "Numbers?" Anita asked, lawyer brain, wanting the scaffolding of values, even as her eyes stayed on the people in the room who would have to carry them. Dr. Saraf hesitated. "On volume and what I'm seeing, if even half are what they appear to be, 8 to 12 wholesale. Retail is a storytelling contest. 10 is a nice round number to put in a headline you're going to hate." 10,
May repeated softly. 10 million blue mornings. They documented Dr. Saraf's preliminaries. They photographed Anita holding the onion skin while her colleague filmed her reading it aloud for chain of custody reasons that would irritate but also save them later. They called Del Toro in to witness the open tube as a neutral, and he tried to stand so he didn't block anyone's camera while still being visible enough to be a wall. It felt like doing right. It felt like building a bridge out of form so that the weight of what they were carrying didn't fall through old holes. They had naded across maybe 3 planks when the white van came back. This time it did not pretend to be bread. It pulled to the curb like a solution to its own problem. The passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out in jeans and a field jacket with a patch that had more meaning than style. She wasn't more than 40. Her hair was storm black and tied back. She walked like a person who didn't need to remember how to move under weight. Charcoal slid out of the driver's side and looked like a man who, for once, was relieved to be outranked. They knocked, the kind of knock that earned its politeness. "Come," Anita said, voice cool and shaped like court. The woman flashed identification that made Del Toro stand up a little straighter. The seal was real. The letters were the kind that get their own budget line. She didn't flourish it, and she didn't apologize for it. She let people read and look up on their own time. "I'm Hannah Rowan, Director Cultural Property Recovery with the Office of..." She named a department that did not need numbing here. "I believe you have something that belongs to more than one country. Several communities, and a ledger my father spent the last 15 years of his life looking for." "H," May whispered. "Rowan. H. Rowan." Hannah smiled, small and with corners. "He was H. My mother said the initial made him look like a spy, which amused him because he was mostly a diver who kept bad records on purpose. He died still sure the second can existed." She nodded toward the titanium. "I am here to be wrong or right with him." They showed her. Tamsin watched Hannah's face watch the blue. There was no greed in it and no triumph. There was something like grief and mathematics braided together. When she touched the onion skin, she did it like a daughter touches a sleeve that still smells like a father's soap. "He would be ashamed of the first years of the hunt," she said. "Men tried to make these about money. His last years were about doing the book right. We've got names." She looked up at Tamsin. "We will have to fight for some of them. We will lose some. We will win enough." "And what happens to Miss Mercer?" Anita asked, like a friend and a litigator and someone who put food on her table by not letting people be turned into paper. She bought a demilled exercise body fair because someone typed demilled on a tag and forgot to ask a diver what the weld seam says. She's not a thief. She's the reason this is not already in pieces in a pocket. Hannah's eyes were tired and clean. "Miss Mercer gets paid for the casing under the rules that apply. Miss Mercer gets protection from men who think jackets are warrants. Miss Mercer gets a whole lot of questions, and Miss Mercer gets named, if she wants, as the person who made sure H's ledger didn't die in a drawer." "I don't want money for what isn't mine," Tamsin said, and surprised herself by how much she meant it. "I want these stones to go where the letter says they should go, into light with names attached. I want a copy of the ledger." She swallowed. "I want to know the names." Hannah looked at her like an answer. "You'll have them, piece by maddening piece." The rest of the day remembered to pass. Papers were signed and scanned with phones and actual scanners because redundancy is a religion when you're carrying old promises. The tube was sealed again with fresh tamper tags with serials that would live in 3 separate notebooks in 3 separate places. Del Toro signed in the box for witness and looked proud of his handwriting. Dr. Saraf took custody for a ride that would be indelicate, if not done slow. She promised slowness like an oath. Anita made copies of copies and put one in Tamsin's hand like a talisman.
When the door rolled down behind the last government shoe sole and the police truck finally turned a corner toward lunch, the shop exhaled, so hard the empty coffee cups skated an inch. They stood in the quiet their own lives make when news had stopped happening at them and started happening because of them. May leaned her head on the hoist beam like she was thanking a tree. "You okay?" she asked without looking at Tamsin. "I don't know what that means anymore," Tamsin said. "I think I am. I think I won't be.
I think I'll be again." Bavik sat on the floor with his back against a tool chest and laughed in a way that leaked tears. "I have finals, you know," he said to no one. "I have to write about Fourier transforms, and I keep seeing blue." Cam handed Tamsin a bottle of water, and the look that goes with it when someone says, "Drink, not because you are thirsty, but because your body is going to need to, and if we don't remind it, it will forget." "You did good," he said, and the words were simple enough to carry. Tamsin watched a gull drift past the high window like a note held too long, and then write. She thought of her father and his stapled book and the way he'd written in the margin once next to a drawing of a shell fuse. "If you can't know, don't lie to yourself. Stand still until you do." She had stood still today. It had felt like walking a very old plank over very new water. It had worked long enough for names to arrive. They packed the shop back into itself. The hoist emptied, the chain coiled, the bench wiped, and the places where blue had lain touched once more with a cloth that had no lint and all the reverence you can put into cotton. Evening remembered itself across the harbor. The depot yard down the road followed a path of ordinary again, forklifts beeping and men swearing with affection. Tamsin closed the big door, and then the small one, and then the lock she was going to replace in the morning with one that did not scream before it broke. She didn't sleep much. When she did, she dreamt of a torpedo swimming through air with velvet in its mouth, and her father standing on a pier holding out a yard of oak like a man offering a daughter a way to touch danger and still laugh. Morning brought emails like gulls. Hannah sent a photo from a table under different lights. The velvet open, the pouches laid like a grid you could walk your hope across. The caption said simply, "It begins." Anita emailed a PDF that sounded like law and smelled like guardrails. Dr. Seraph sent a spreadsheet with weights and preliminary codes that made Bavik text 3 fire emojis and then an apology to himself for using fire about blue. The harbor woke into a day that wanted to be ordinary and would never quite manage it again. Customers came. They always did. A man with a boat cleat that had decided to be multiple pieces. A woman who needed a bracket for a window that had decided to love the wind too much. People said, "Heard something about a torpedo." And Tamsin said, "You and me both," and let them get it out of their system so they could get back to the business of living. Midday, a courier knocked with a padded envelope that had a tracking label that meant men somewhere knew on which pallet it had sat and for how long. The return address was a P.O. box that could have been anywhere, and probably was. Inside, a book whose cover was plain linen and whose title was a line from H's letter, "Publish the Truth." The Ledger.
She set it on the bench and touched the spine the way you touch a sleeping infant's hair. She did not open it right away. She made coffee she did not need. She cleared space that did not require clearing. She breathed like someone about to put their palm on a church door they weren't sure they were allowed to enter. Then she opened it. Names. Not all of them full. Not all spelled the way the people who owned them would have wanted. But names linked to weights and places. Villages whose syllables tasted like stone and river and cold. Lines written in a hand that had betrayed a diver's life. The frozen neatness of someone used to making letters in cramped spaces where pencils are awkward and ink insists on laws. A few entries had notes that were stories in 11 words. For teacher who kept school open. For widow who keeps 5 children. For doctor who leaves when men with guns come and then comes back when they are gone. Tamsin felt something loosen between her ribs. Something that had lived there under the shape of money and the noise men make about it. This was not a treasure. It was a record of stubborn kindness disguised as a cache. She turned a page and saw names she recognized, not from this town, but from a photograph that had hung in the diner for 20 years. The black and white of a man with a mustache that made him look like he disapproved of sunrises. Underneath, Hassan R., watchman, port. Tamsin read the note and laughed and did not mind that she was crying. He had died years ago in the next town, quiet as a tide. His daughters still came in to sell pie at festivals.
The bell over the door chimed. It was the daughter. Of course it was. She held a box with a broken hinge she wanted welded, because some things just don't close right after time hands them down. "I heard you had an exciting day," the daughter said, eyes warm. "I thought I'd come by while my oven does the work that makes people like me." She set the box down and then saw the ledger. "What's that?" Tamsin could have said nothing. She could have said paperwork and been right. She could have said later, and maybe she should have. Instead, she turned the book so the woman could see the line with her father's name and kept a finger on the margin like a person holding down a map in wind. The woman read the entry once, and then again, lips moving because sometimes you need a name to come out of your mouth to be true. Her hand went to her throat, and her other hand went to the counter, because bodies need wood when souls decide to jump. He never told us. He hated praise. We told him it was a problem. She laughed and it cracked, and she let it. He brought a crate home once with stones, and we told him to get that out. Get that out. We're not that kind of story. She traced the words with a finger, and then stopped, because oil and paper have their own commandments. She looked at Tamsin. "He would have liked you." "Me?" Tamsin said, startled. "Yes," the woman said. "People who listen to things that do not have voices, stones, water, our town." They made copies of the page. They sent one to Hannah. They got one under the glass on the diner counter next to a photo of a fish no one believed and a clipping about a high school team that had won something no one remembered. They kept the ledger closed unless a name on the page matched a face in town, and then they opened it carefully, like an old friend's memory. The calls grew teeth and then lost them. Reporters came and were polite because Anita had taught them to be. A man with a different kind of badge than Charcoal's tried to turn names into politics, and Hannah was surgical and kind and shut him down without leaving bruises. Money did paperwork around the edges like it always will. A museum offered a wing. A foundation offered a grant. A lawyer from a far place sent a letter that wanted to be a demand, and Anita folded it into a reply that wanted to be a brick and was. Tamsin kept working. The shop's bell chimed for hinges, for boats, for the small things that make towns stay the shape they were before the world remembered them. At night, she read the ledger like a novel that refused to explain itself. And in the morning, she answered emails that came from places she would never see. One evening, late, when the harbor had gone black and the gulls had accepted that math always says come back tomorrow for fish, Tamsin found a thin envelope under the shop door. No stamp, no return address. The handwriting belonged to someone patient and left-handed. Inside, a single page, no letterhead, a sentence. "You didn't give them away, you gave them back. Thank you." No signature. No H, just a small hand-inked symbol in the corner, a diver's flag, the red slash through white that means a human is under there trying to live. She pinned it above her bench next to her father's stapled book. The two made a chorus in her head that sounded like the ocean learning a new word. Weeks later, when the first restitution case closed in a courtroom she would never step in, Hannah sent her a photo of a woman in a headscarf holding a small velvet pouch and smiling like a person hearing an old song again. The caption was 3 words, "For the teacher." Tamsin stood in her shop and listened to the quiet and understood that finding the cash had not turned her life into something else. It had made it more of what it already was. A place where broken things came to be made better by hands that didn't mind learning. When a knock came at the door and she looked up to see Charcoal standing there, with his jacket looking like a jacket and not a roll, she didn't tense. She went to the door and opened it and let a man who had been a problem for an hour and a solution for a day stand in a room where light did the work it had to. "I came to say thank you," he said, which sounded odd coming out of a mouth used to other verbs, "and to bring you this." He held out a small, battered tin badge on a ribbon that had been blue once and was now the color of a memory that had learned to fade properly. The badge was stamped with a name, H. Rowan. Under it, Diver. Tamsin took it like you take a fragile truth. "I'm not family," she said. "He'd have said you are now," Charcoal said, and managed to say it without making it sentimental. "So would she," he added, nodding in some general direction where women who do hard jobs well live. "We're having a small thing at the depot tomorrow. Not press, locals, if you want." She did. She went. They put the badge on a hook next to a photo of a younger man in a wetsuit laughing at waves, and someone told a story about a time he had pulled a wallet out of a fish because the ocean likes jokes. People ate bad cake on paper plates and good soup and paper cups, and no one made speeches that lasted longer than a sip. On the way home, Tamsin stopped at the diner and looked at the ledger page under the glass again. Someone had tucked a poem next to it. No name. Just lines about blue that got the tint right. Back at the shop, she closed up, and then, because some habits are prayers, she laid her palm against the hoist's old steel and the torpedo cradle's timbers and thanked them for holding until people arrived who could carry. Out on the water, a light blinked from the breakwater like a person remembering their own name after too long a silence. Tamsin turned the sign to closed and slipped the diver's badge's ribbon over a nail above the bench. The shop hummed the way working places do when the day is done, but the work is not finished because work is the way we stay true. She reached for the ledger to put it back in its drawer and felt something stiff beneath the back cover. A second sheet she hadn't noticed, thin as onion skin and taped flush to the board. She teased it up with the corner of a fingernail and read an H's hand, small and neat and ruthless. If you are the kind of person who reads to the very end, there is one more thing. The can you found is the second. The first was smaller. It went by sea in '66 with a name I won't write. He knew where to take it. If he failed, you'll find proof of failure in the logbook of a vessel that left this harbor and never came home. Its name has been painted over twice, but paint forgets. Go look at the West Yard, row 4, hulls bleached like bone. You will know it by the gap in the keel where a diver swore and swam anyway. Tamsin stood very still. She could feel the shape of the yard in her head, the west row where boats waited to be parted and reborn, the keel shadows like ribs. She could feel the town around her like a hand on her back, warm and urging. Her phone buzzed. A text from Hannah. "Ledger page 117. You're going to want to see this." Tamsin looked from the note to the phone to the door. The shop felt suddenly like a starting line. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.